if you'll just indulge me for one moment, this is just a wonderful sight. I just have to record this for posterity. Okay, everyone smile and say Facebook. Okay, cool. Who is on Facebook? Who is on Twitter? Who's on Instagram? Who's not on anything? All right, wow, okay. How are those 8-track tape collections coming along? They're coming back, don't worry about that, they're coming back. I kid. Oops, let me get my handy clicker here. Quick question, and there's no right or wrong answer, but it gives me a sense of where we're at. Who might have read my first novel, Hotel on the Corner, Bitter and Sweet? Oh, holy cow, okay. There's that one woman in the back, both hands. Just like, all right. I asked that because that book is just doing its own thing. I tend to say that that book has a career and I'm just along for the ride. And I stole that from Pamela Anderson, who said, my boobs have a career, I'm just along for the ride. And it's apropos in both instances. That's not American Sign Language for boobs, in case you were wondering. But because that book is still, it's still just chugging along, I tend to give people the hotel update of the strange and unusual and surprising things that are happening with that book. The latest, well, there's a bunch of things, but one that struck me as remarkable was Hotel became the #1 book in Norway, which is so weird, right? I mean, it's like, at no time was I writing this book and I just think, oh yeah, this book's gonna rock Oslo, That did not happen. And it was perplexing for me because the book is about the Japanese internment and it's about race relations and the main characters are Chinese and Japanese, and there's not a huge Asian population in Norway. It's kind of a monoculture. And it's interesting. I did 2 book tours in Norway. And the thing I discovered is that in the age of the internet, we learn about other cultures with a speed and a level of accessibility we didn't have 100 years ago. And so it's very easy for us to stay in our silos and stay in our lanes. But now, despite things with borders, things transcend those borders. And so when I was in Norway on this last tour, I went out to dinner with my publicist, my Norwegian publicist. We're in Oslo, and he said, there's this cool new restaurant. They serve this amazing food. You got to check it out. It's called a taco. So there are tacos in Norway. The tacos have arrived in Norway. But it's true. Food and art and sports and entertainment, these things transcend borders. And no matter what we do at the borders of our own country, these things penetrate through the internet, or people travel, we experience different things. And so there are tacos in Norway. I find that wonderful. But it reminds me of the comedian Aziz Ansari, whose parents immigrated to this country from India. He was born in South Carolina, very dark skin, Indian family, raised in South Carolina. And someone asked him, South Carolina, isn't it really racist? And he's like, I hate racism, but I love a good biscuit. So, there's something to be said about food. The other thing that's happened with Hotel on the Corner, Bitter and Sweet, is it is read widely in schools now. And so somewhere along the way, I became homework, which is a little strange. And I have mixed feelings about this. And the way it happened was organically. That book appeared on students' summer reading lists. And it just spread all over the country. Last year, I was invited to go to Switzerland to speak to 6 high schools who are reading Hotel in Switzerland. So it's kind of doing its own thing. But I wasn't really aware of this. It just started popping up on the periphery of my radar. And what happened is, it became summer reading It's now required reading in a lot of school districts, in Washington State, in fact. But what happened is it became summer reading. And I know what happens to summer reading, because I had a house full of teenagers, is they get their summer reading list on the last day of school, and it goes into their backpack, and the backpack goes into the corner of their room, and it collects dust all summer. And then like a week before school begins, they dig it out, and they text their friends, like, what are we supposed to read? What are we supposed to do? And they all go to this website called sparknotes.com. And I'm not on sparknotes.com, but I am on the internet. And so kids track me down. And so now, every fall, from about August to September, every day I will get 20 to 30 emails from high school students. And they say these unbelievably sincere things like, Mr. Ford, I loved your book, Motel on the Corner of Sweet and Sour is my all-time favorite. If you could just answer these 12 questions. And this took on, it took a weird turn in my household when my own children were assigned that book in high school. And it's not cool when dad is homework. Far from it. And what happened is my daughter Carissa, when that book was assigned to her, she went out on the internet and she went out onto Twitter and she found all these tweets from high school students commenting about my book. And because she found endless joy sharing these with me, I'm going to share some of them with you. This tweet is from Mariah Cobb, and Mariah tweets, "Nobody read Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet. They'll slowly tear out your heart and you'll cry your eyes out. Hashtag stupid English class." There we go. This tweet is from Nicholas Reed, and Nicholas tweets, "Who has a study guide for Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet? SparkNotes didn't have it. Hashtag emergency." That's always good. This tweet is from Morgan Gaccioni, and Morgan tweets, "Anyone want to give me a good summary of Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet? I'm willing to pay in cash." Some money to be made out there. This is a good one. This is from Alana, and Alana's Twitter handle is Banana Alana. It's very sweet. And what Banana Alana is tweeting is, "I would rather read Animal Farm every day of my life than effing read Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet." You can feel the love. And this one is from Emma, and Emma tweets, "More like Hotel on the Corner of This Book Sucks Boulevard." What Emma doesn't realize is I am fueled creatively by the angst of teenagers. So, when Emma gets that pimple on prom night, I just get stronger. It's okay. It's all right. And I am showing you the salacious ones, but I do get just as many, if not more, and they're of a different nature. And they tend to look something like this, where it says, "This is the first time I was forced to read a book that I actually loved." And, from like a 16-year-old boy, that's a high compliment, It doesn't really get any better than that. And in the publishing industry, we often regard young male readers as this unreachable audience. And so when I can reach one of those kids, and I usually see in his little avatar, he's wearing his football jersey, and we call these resistant readers. And if I can reach one of those guys, I feel like in some small way I've made the world a slightly better place. And there's just something especially rewarding about that to me, because I think not just myself, but probably everyone in here, if you have a love of reading, at some point in your life, you encountered what I call the gateway drug book, and something that kind of turned the lights on in your brain for reading, for story, for literature. And so if I can be that for that kid, that's kind of a beautiful thing. But, Hotel is about the Japanese internment. And it's about race relations. It's about the Seattle jazz scene. It's a father and son story, but at its core, it's really a story that's all about love. It's a love story. And so I want to talk about that a little bit, because this definitely ties into race. And we're going to talk about love first. And specifically love stories. And love stories are these weird creatures. And I love love stories. But everyone reacts to love stories differently. We interpret them through the lens of our own experience. And so if we were all at the movie theater and we're watching a tearjerker love story type of movie, when the lights come on at the end, I like to look around the audience and see how people react. And there's always that segment of the viewing audience, and they've been deeply moved and they're fishing in their purse for Kleenex. And then there's another segment that are just looking around bewildered, like, that was a waste of $10, you know? And I knew where I fell on that emotional Richter scale, not just as a writer, but as a human, at a very young age. And for me, this moment of discovery was like, I think I was probably 9 years old. It's like a third grader, second grader, somewhere in there. And at the time, I was living in this town of Ashland, Oregon. It's this quaint little theater town on the southern Oregon border. And if you're growing up in southern Oregon in the late 60s, early 70s, we were blessed or cursed, depending on how you look at it, to only have one television channel. Cable hadn't reached the hinterlands, and we lived in this valley, and even though we had the rabbit ears with the tinfoil, we could only get one channel. And so as a kid, you just watch whatever's on. And as a result, I just watched some really weird television. And I watched this one movie that really informed the kind of storyteller I would become. And it was this typical ABC movie of the week. It was this movie called James at 15. Does anyone remember this show? Holy cow, yes. My people are here. Okay, yeah. James at 15, typical ABC movie of the week. My given name is James, so I'm kind of interested. And it's set in Oregon, so I'm kind of interested. And I only have one channel, so I'm going to watch it anyway. And it was this very simple love story. It's this boy pining away for this impossible girl. And he gets the girl in the end in a very sweet, simple 70s kind of way. It's not the Jersey Shore. It's not the Real Housewives of Helena, Montana. Nothing that scandalous. But James at 15, it didn't end with that scene. It ended with James and his family packing up and moving to Boston. And so it ends on the scene where, he's in the back of the station wagon and they got the U-Haul packed, and he's waving goodbye to his sweetheart who's on the corner, waving back. And they just pull away from the curb. And there was this sad piano music, and the credits just started rolling, and that was the end. And I remember watching this moment as a little kid and just thinking, oh, love sucks. This is horrible. I was so caught up in this moment. And I was so attached to these characters that it really affected me to the point of tears. I'm just like tears streaming down my face, and my father sitting in his easy chair next to me. And I'm a dad. I see plenty of gentlemen here. I know there's lots of dads in the room. I don't think I'm giving away any particular dad secret, but every dad has what I call the dad list. Every dad has some sort of list. And I picture my dad sitting in his easy chair, just regarding his young son, just bawling at this cheesy movie of the week and taking out his imaginary dad list and just thinking, football scholarship? No. Basketball? No. And as a result, not just of that night, but a lot of nights like that, my dad actually encouraged me to go into the arts. So I owe a lot to my dad in that regard. But the tragic thing is, I go to school the next day, and everyone on the playground, they're calling me James at 15. Hey, James at 15, because they all saw the same movie, right? We only had one channel. But they hated it. I loved it. And it was terrible. In a textbook moment of peer pressure collapse, I took that memory, I tucked it in the attic of my mind, and I didn't think about James at 15 for decades, literally. It wasn't until I was fumbling around with this thing called fiction, trying to figure out what to write about. And, you know, I'm half Chinese on my dad's side, and I never had written anything with Asian American characters because I didn't think anybody would care, let alone the population of Norway. So I didn't go there. And I love history. I'm a history geek. But I really thought history was the realm of nonfiction, and I didn't go there. And I love stories. I have a deep, abiding weakness for very emotional stories, and I didn't go there. But where I did go with my then fiance, now wife, is we went to one of these weekends for newly engaged couples, which I've learned that is a bizarre social experiment. It's really unfair. I mean, everyone means well, but you go in and you're judging everybody, give them 6 months, that kind of stuff. And we were way older than everybody in the room, and they all thought we were the host couple. Like, where do we sit? Like, we're in love too, Junior. Sit down. And what they had us do is they had us stand up and go around the room and tell the abbreviated story of how each couple first met. And everyone's still in college or just out of college. And so this young man, and he stands up, this sterling young gentleman, and he turns to his beloved, and he says, and I quote, "Well, I woke up, she had my t-shirt on, figured I'd better ask her what her name was." So romantic, right? It goes around the room, and everyone's first date, their first meeting was like a frat party or a spring break or Jello shooters were involved, and it comes around to me, and I had to stand up in front of this very young gathering, this post-collegiate coupling experiment, and confess to them that I met my wife at that hotbed of swinging singles activity known as the public library. And that's what I realized. I wasn't James at 15, I was James at 40. And I was this weird, precocious kid, and I realized I'd become a weird, precocious adult, and it freed me up to write what I wanted to write about, which was, I wanted to write a love story. And I wanted to write something with pretty serious emotions, and I wanted to write something historical, and I wanted to write something multicultural. This is the photo that's in the front of that book. This photo was taken by a very famous photographer named Dorothea Lange. That little girl, her name is May Yanagi, and we've become friends. She's in her 80s. She lives in Sacramento, and when I do book events, May comes out and signs books with me. And this was as they were being put on a bus and taken to the Tanforan racetrack in California before they were later taken to their final internment camp. And the woman behind her, kind of with a handkerchief to her face, that's her mother, who is 9 months pregnant, who gave birth to her sister, May's sister, in a horse stall at the racetrack. And I wanted to write, in many ways, about those stories, things that not all of us know about. And in writing these stories and researching these stories, I had to look at my own identity. And there were a lot of things in my own family history that I didn't know about. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, because much of what I write about is really an exploration of who I am, which began as this little kid. This is me. Man, I was cute. What happened? What happened along the way? I was a little half-Asian kid at the tail end of the Vietnam War. And so I had the last name Ford. Everyone assumed I'm like a war baby. Like my father was a GI, and I must be, I'd come home. The term Eurasian was used a lot. And a lot of the mixed race kids that I knew those were their circumstances. But I didn't quite connect to them because I'm not first generation, I'm fourth generation. My family's very westernized, very American. And so for me, just understand my own identity has always been this work in progress. This is me in college. You can't really tell there, but there's my photo. And I think by that photo, I look super Chinese, right? But you can look at me now, and I'm sort of what I call stealth Asian, you know? I have the last name Ford, I'm kind of ethnically ambiguous. But in college, people saw me and they knew something was up, and they didn't know what that was. And so they would always ask, like, what are you? And I never mind that problem. Some people are deeply offended by that question. It never bothers me. It really depends on how the question's asked. And I did a book event in Portland, Oregon, and I landed, and the woman who picked me up, who's my, the driver to get me to the bookstore, she learned I was from Montana. And she said, why are you from Montana? I'm like, there's a nicer way to ask that question. And the same thing with identity. When people are like, wow, what are you? That's cool. I'm like, this is what I am, the chosen breed, right? But in college, people had to guess. And I find it curious, they always thought I was two things: Russian, and I don't even know what that means. But it was the Cold War, and I looked different, and so they just identified different with the other, whatever that is. So are you Russian? And the other one was Native American. That maybe I could see, because in Seattle, there's for a Seattle that's named after a Native American chief, there's not very many indigenous people walking the streets. And so that came up a lot. But really, this is me in college with my mom. And my mom was from Arkansas, a little town of 250 people in the Ozarks. And here's me, this, ambiguously Asian kid. And in many instances, people easily identify me as Caucasian. Here I am with my mom. I call my mom Betty Crocker White. That's kind of how I describe it. What we would imagine. And it's confusing when you're biracial, because I didn't always identify as Caucasian because I was raised in a very Asian American household. And in a very Asian American household, we eat very Asian American food, like chicken feet. And then your friends come over and they're looking at what you're eating, and you realize, like, wait, no one else eats chicken feet? You have this moment. And yet, here I am with my Chinese family, and I think, I blend in there. Everyone in that photo but me speaks Chinese, speaks Cantonese. Some even speak Korean. And because I didn't speak the language, I never felt Asian enough. And so much of my college career, there's me in my dorm, was like this, was being presented with forms, whether they're for an apartment or a job or a student loan, and there would be a field that says, what's your race? And it would be Asian, and it'd be white, and I'd think, what parent do I like more today? I didn't know how to answer these questions. And now there's a lot of, maybe the term Hapa, of half Asian, which is kind of like a Kleenex type of word, often for just mixed race. And that wasn't prevalent then. So I was just this strange kid. And I remember this moment at Seattle University where I'm walking across the quad and I see a young man who looks like me, and he's walking in the other direction, and we spotted each other and we both just vectored together. And when we approached each other, we were both just like, right? I don't know what you are, but you're like me. And he was half Korean, I'm half Chinese, and we were just like, this is so weird. And we had this bonding moment. And it's interesting. I visit a lot of colleges now. A couple weeks ago, I was at Central Michigan University, and they took me on a tour of their diversity center, which didn't exist when I was in college. And it was an interesting experience for me, because I'm in this place, and there's people, not just like foreign exchange students, but people that are mixed race, or people that have different gender orientations, or people that are just coming to a cultural exploration night, and they're going to try this food from Bangladesh or something like that. It was fascinating. And while I was there was one student, and he commented on, this isn't fair. Like, why isn't there like a white culture center? And the director of the diversity center said, that's because you have frat houses and sororities. You have always had your own space. For 200 years, you have had your own space. And so just now, people of color are kind of having their own space. But I'm still confused because I'm Hapa, because I'm half, because I'm always pulled in two different directions. And so for me, I started to look at my own roots, of the ones that I understood the least, and that was my Asian American roots. This is my great-grandfather on the left. His name was Min Chung. I think it was mentioned in the introduction. He came over to this country in 1865 when he was 13 years old. And he came over to work for the Tonopah Mining Company. Came through San Francisco, ended up in Tonopah, Nevada. And, oh, that's my great-aunt, Rose, on the right. That's his daughter. I think she's super cute. But Min Chung, my great-grandfather, he changed his name to William Ford. And I describe that as someone coming to this country from Pakistan and changing their name to Chuck Norris, It's like, America, let's do this. And so he did. And he changed his name to William Ford. He was known as Billy Ford. And I like to show this because it's the two of us together. Just like, you can't escape your genetics, It's so weird how much I resemble this man. And I did a lot of research into Billy Ford. And he's written up in all these newspapers all over Nevada, but specifically in Tonopah and later in Reno. This is one of the articles I love. This just kills me. My great-grandfather had 6 children, and the family joke was that he had a child every 4th of July. It was a way of expressing his Americanness. And it's, he hails from the Flowery Kingdom and says that he always celebrates the 4th of July this way. Billy is known in Tonopah, the Southern District, being the only celestial. That was kind of how they referred to Asians, Orientals, celestials. It sounds very poetic. Only celestial on record who can whistle Yankee Doodle. And being a proud William Ford, Billy Ford, here in America, it didn't take him long to exercise his Second Amendment rights. Billy, he got in a gunfight. This is my great-grandfather, got in a quarrel with another worker, shot him in self-defense, and killed him. And, oddly enough, he was exonerated. Self-defense. And I often wonder if his name and his identity helped him with the jury. He was expressing much more of an American identity versus the other guy. And so he was exonerated. His life story is chronicled in these little snippets in the newspapers. I mean, ultimately, Ford family is destitute. How would you like just to, you go bankrupt or something, and then you open up the Helena IR, like, Jones family loses it all. But it makes news. But what happened, because the family was destitute, his youngest son, who happened to be born on the 4th of July, 1907, he left town at 13, the same age as my great-grandfather. And he went to Hollywood. And he traveled with a Chinese boys' choir. And because the family was destitute, he never returned. This is my grandfather. His name was George Ford. And, he went to Hollywood, and he appeared as a bit actor in more than 300 films. I have his Screen Actors Guild card and receipts from his pay stubs from the studios. But you'll notice he changed his name back to George Chung. His real name, his birth name was George Ford, but his screen name was George Chung, because there would be these casting sessions and they'd say George Ford, and this Chinese guy would walk out and it'd be very confusing. And so he went back to George Chung. And while he was in Hollywood, he befriended everybody. I have his photo albums from that time period. And these are all signed to my grandfather, from Clark Gable, from Betty Davis, from Randolph Scott, from Cary Grant on the side. And he was in all these movies, but he was never able to be anything more than a bit player, because the leading roles at the time, if there was a cultural opportunity, went to Caucasian actors. We call this yellow face. And, you know, it's kind of awkward to look at. I tend not to beat up people in the past for the social norms of today. I think that's unfair. I think there's a lot to be learned by it, though. And we can all laugh at John Wayne as Genghis Khan. I mean, come on, that's the Duke right there. And it's kind of tragic that Mickey Rooney's, you know, his career has this little asterisk of Mr. Kuniyoshi from Breakfast at Tiffany's, which is still a great movie. But, you know, it's worth looking at. I love this photo in particular. This is my grandfather on the far left. This is on the set of Shanghai Express, shot in 1931 with Marlene Dietrich and Anna May Wong. The man in the middle is a Swedish actor named Varner Öland in yellowface. And Varner Öland, played Charlie Chan in half of the Charlie Chan movies. The other half, there was another Caucasian actor named Sidney Toler. But I love this photo. It's such a kind of a moment in time. And in one of those Charlie Chan films, my grandfather actually played, without, I think he said one word, number one son, who was this kind of, you know, Charlie Chan had this family. Which brings me to my grandfather's number one son, his only son, who was George Ford Jr. And I love this photo of my parents. It's like my Chinese dad, who came from, you know, the East. My mom, despite growing up in the Ozarks, her family line goes through Constance Hopkins, who was on the Mayflower. So this is really East meets West. And it's so fascinating for me, because I just assumed that, you know, these are my parents. But as an adult, I look back on the 60s, and I'm like, the only couplings of an Asian man and a Caucasian woman that I could think of was my parents and Bruce Lee and his wife Linda. That was it. And it was such a moment in time. They were kind of pioneers, because when you think about it, and you can't read the type here, but the gray states were the states that forbid interracial marriage until 1967. My parents were married in 1966, so when my parents got married, they couldn't even get married in my mom's home state. They got married in California. And yet we'd been here for quite a while. I considered us to be very American. So American that this is also my family. The two gentlemen on the left and the lower gentleman on the right are my great uncles. Two served in the US Army during World War II, and the man in the lower left served in the Chinese Army during World War II. They all served in Burma with the Flying Tigers, keeping the Flying Tigers in the air to fight the Japanese, and then that's a cousin in the upper right. And the tragic thing is, you know, they served their country, and then they came home. And if you were a person of color, coming home after serving in the military, you didn't have access to the GI Bill, and you were not welcome at VFWs and other veteran organizations. And you often had to come home and live in your red-lined neighborhood. Who knows what a red-line neighborhood is? All right, okay. For those of you that don't know what a red-line neighborhood is, up until 1967, until the Civil Rights era, most metropolitan cities would designate an area where all the people of color could live. And you would have trouble renting or buying property outside of that zone. And it wasn't just black people or Asian people. It was often Italian Americans and Jewish Americans. And so this is Seattle at the time. And the red, as you can see, is that cluster to the right. There's a large cluster of red. And this is a map sort of showing the neighborhoods, so to speak. And the red is described as hazardous. The red is also where people of color lived. This red line neighborhood, that's in that black cluster, that's where my grandparents lived on Beacon Hill. And it's troubling, but it's worth remembering. This was one of the line items in the covenants by which homes were sold in the Seattle area. And in many instances, it took, the Fair Housing Act in the late 60s to get rid of these covenants, where you could put something in your property that would say, this can't be sold to a person of the non-Caucasian race. And this seems like so far away, but the last of these covenants went away in Texas, in Highland Park in the year 2000. These were still among us. And oddly enough, I visited probably 100 high schools all over the country. The only high school experience that went really sideways was that district, which is quite telling. Also, I guess it was 5 years ago, I was invited to a resort community in Michigan called Bayview. And it's this private community, these wonderful homes on the lake. And I arrived at Bayview, and I Googled the place because I'm going to give a talk and I wanted to know a little bit about the local color. And I realized there was this big lawsuit with the Bayview Association because they don't allow Jewish people to buy a home there. This is ongoing now, that lawsuit. It's part of that Hobby Lobby and the baker that wouldn't make a cake for a gay couple. It's kind of part of that same using one group's spiritual beliefs to keep another group out. So we're still kind of fighting these battles. And so for me, when I think about race, I think about truth. And I think about how we parse truth. And this is something that I saw, and I added the half-truth to the bottom, of a way of looking at truth. Objective truth. I think we can all agree what objective truth is. Objective truths are things that you can measure, or you can record. I'm here standing in front of you. That is objectively true. Personal truths. These are deeply personal held beliefs, like, is candy corn delicious or not? You can't prove it. This also happens to cover areas like, deep religious convictions. As much as some people of deep faith want to say that you can absolutely prove it, you really can't. But it's a personal truth, and it's powerful, and it's important, and it's constitutionally protected, and I get that. There's political truths, and I think we are living in the age of, if I say it enough, people will believe it. And you know who I'm talking about. But for me, when it comes to race, the most problematic things for me are half-truths. And if you look at the Japanese internment, and these are families that were evacuated from Bainbridge Island, the first 7,000 people that were taken to Manzanar, or to Minidoka in Idaho, there was a symphony of half-truths created to lay the groundwork for the Japanese internment. Just one example of those half-truths was that the FBI raided Japanese American homes. And in many of those homes, they found maps, detailed maps of the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. From my high school in Washington, I could look down and see PSNS, the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, and there's always like 2 aircraft carriers, a battleship, a frigate, a destroyer, and they had maps. So they must be collaborators, spies, saboteurs. It wasn't until the 80s when the Reagan administration did a thorough investigation of what transpired, which led to the redress, the apology, and the reparations to those affected, that they found that those maps were just printed in an issue of Life magazine on an article on the shipyard. And that Life magazine was probably in 20,000 homes in the Seattle area. And so I worry about half-truths when it comes to race. And I don't even think about what the rest of the truth is. I think about what are people expecting me to do with this information? Why am I only being told? And I think, both political parties do this. There isn't one that I think is more, more grievous than the other. But it's something to think about. And with the internment, I did a book event in Chicago, my first book tour. And a woman came up to me and she said, I taught high school history for 30 years and I never taught the internment. And there was an embargo on that information. The photos that were taken by Dorothea Lange and also Ansel Adams, they went into internment camps, shot wonderful imagery that was embargoed and not released to the public until the 90s. And it's one of those half-truth situations. The photos that were released were of smiling people, not kind of a Dust Bowl era of people behind barbed wire. The thing with the internment is, my daughter came home from middle school, and her history book was about 600 pages. And I was curious, so I grabbed the book, and I went to the index, found the Japanese internment, and I found it, and there's like a paragraph. And it's like, okay, at least it's in there. 600 pages, we have a lot of history to pack in there. But it got me thinking. We'll do a little experiment here. If you know the answer to this question, just shout it out. The cotton gin was invented by? Eli Whitney. Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. And probably till the day you die, you'll remember that Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. But the thing is, if we forget that Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, we're not really diminished as a people. But if we forget that we incarcerated 120,000 people, most of whom were American born, then we're losing something. Thank you. Thank you. That means a lot. I appreciate that. But I want to talk about where we go now. And I think this is interesting. My friend Kip Fulbeck is a photographer. And he put this book together 15 years ago. And he shot just portraits of mixed Asian people. And they were so popular that he did a whole series of gallery showings of mixed race people. And they would be people of just the most interesting combinations. Someone would be like Jewish and Persian and Navajo or something like this, just everything. And it was really cool. And Kip dived into the deep pools of humanity. And he became famous for this. And he would do these photo shoots in Seattle and San Francisco and Dallas and New York. And he would let it be known, the press release would go out ahead of time that Kip Fulbeck's going to be in town, he's going to be doing shoots for a new gallery showing. And 3 days of photography would fill up like that. And then he went to Hawaii. And he couldn't get anyone to sit for a photograph. They're like, what's the big deal? And I honestly, people ask me about race, and I'm always an optimist because I do think that's our future. I mean, it's going to take 100 years, but at one point in our country, maybe 150 years ago, 200 years ago, there's an Italian family and an Irish family, and the thought of them intermarrying was just like, against the social norms of the times. But the internet actually does do some good things for us. There's some terrible, toxic things it does for us, but it allows us to get to know one another if we have the mind and the heart and the will to do that. I just want to end with a little note to the future. This is my daughter, Haley, my oldest daughter, who is part Chinese. That's my grandmother, Ethel Chu, who is full Chinese. And I just look at my daughter and I see the future. Of course, it's her very emo, scowling, orange hair phase. So I don't think the whole world is going to have scowling orange hair. But I do look to a time when it matters less and love matters more. And I love this visual. This is a class of high school students in Seattle, and I spoke to this class, and then they all went down to the Seattle's International District and toured around, and they went to the Panama Hotel. And I visit so many high schools, and in the context of those high schools, I'm always edified by how loving and accepting the next generation is and will continue to be. So, yeah, so take heart.